Thank you for joining us for our first ever World Patients Alliance member webinar. This will be the first of what we expect to be many webinars where we will be trying to bring important and relevant information to all of our nearly 200 members now. And hopefully we'll be able to give you information that you'll be able to share with your members. Today, of course, we're going to be talking about COVID-19 and the impact of COVID-19 on all of our patients that we serve. But I want to introduce you first a little bit about the World Patients Alliance. We are just over a year old, started out in late 2018, really into 2019. 2019 and into 2020. And we were officially formed in November of 2019. And over the last year, we have met on a bi-weekly basis in helping form this organization and recruit top quality members like all of you. And I'm going to introduce you to those founders and to those board members in a moment. But we're working very hard to build this organization to be the leading patient group organization in the world for all of our members, all of you. And we're very excited about that. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to some of our board members. You'll see Penny Cohen leads the Chronic Pain Foundation out in California. She's been doing that for more than 40 years. We also have Hussein Jaffrey, Dr. Jaffrey, who is with one of our speakers in Pakistan today, where it's nighttime. And we thank Hussein and Dr. Rashid for participating today. But Hussein runs the Alzheimer's Pakistan organization. He's been involved for many years in patient advocacy. And we also have Carlos Ruiz de Casilla. She is in Peru and runs an organization called Esperanto, which serves cancer patients in Peru. She's very involved across Latin America and worldwide as a top-notch advocate. We have, and also, by the way, Penny is our current treasurer, and Hussein will be the next chair after I am finished with this role. Our treasurer is Jolanta Belinsky from Poland, and Jolanta has been involved in international community representing patients for decades, and she is a great asset to the World Patients Alliance. We have another director, Regina Komanga, and she is in Uganda. She is involved with the community health in Uganda, another fierce advocate. And so we've got a really top-notch board of directors, I think. And I'm Andrew Spiegel, by the way, not so top-notch. But Andrew Spiegel, I've been involved in the colon cancer space, the bowel cancer space for more than 2 decades. So we are very excited to again, bring you our first webinar. And I'm going to turn things over to Penny Cohen, who is our secretary. And Penny's going to give you some more information about the World Patients Alliance. So Penny, why don't you take it over?
Good morning, everyone. It's not morning for all of you. First, I'd like to sort of share our mission with you. Our mission is to be a global voice of patients working toward patient empowerment and engagement, improved access to safe, innovative treatment, and patient-centered healthcare throughout the world. And our vision, and we've worked on these for quite a while, so to make sure that we really covered everything in and been very inclusive. Our vision is that all patients will have access to safe, high quality, and affordable healthcare everywhere in the world. So the World Patient Alliance is a member representation group with close to 200 patient groups throughout the world in 61 countries. And so we really have formed a global international advocacy group, and each one of our members is very important to us. So we thank you all, especially for joining us today, but for your involvement in the organization. And as you know, there's no cost to being a member. So again, we just want to let you know how proud we are to have you, each of you, as one of our members. So one of the things that I want to remind you about is a survey that we sent out right before the holidays. It's a member survey. We have had a number of people who have already responded. Saw a few names pop up this morning, And so I saw that you had also already responded to the survey. So thank you for those who have. But it's also now available in Spanish and French. So if you don't want to do the English version, there's 2 other versions that are available. Please take time to do the survey so we can understand where you're coming from, what your needs are, where your focus is, and how we can best help you in the coming years. We also are going to be sending out an email early next week on how that you can get involved in the WPA. So look for that email. It also is going to have events of 2021 and also our successes of 2020. We want to share what we've accomplished in the last year. I know 2020 was a difficult year for all of us, but what we want to do is to share what we've already accomplished. We were quite amazed when we look back at all the things that we were able to do. And then we are also going to be releasing our updated COVID statement based on the vaccines just coming out and the rollout of vaccines. So next week, look for that email of all of those, all that information. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Andrew. And again, thank you all for joining us.
Yes, thank you, Penny. And one of the things that you can do to help us is to help us recruit members. If you know of top quality patient organizations like yours in disease areas that we may not be representing currently, or in a geographic region that we don't currently have a member, it would be great if you could share that with us, or if you could introduce us to them, because we want to make sure that we're representing every disease known to mankind and every geographic region in the entire world. So you could help us by recruiting other members where we don't have them. So at this point, I want to introduce to you Dr. Michael Ybarra. Dr. Ybarra is the Vice President and Chief Medical Affairs Representative at PhRMA. And PhRMA is an industry trade group for the pharmaceutical manufacturers industry. But Dr. Ybarra, as you'll hear, is also a clinical physician treating patients at the emergency room in Washington, D.C. And he's going to share with you on a recorded video, because he couldn't be here today. We recorded a video yesterday of him. So we're going to play that 20-minute video. And at the end, if you have questions, we're going to provide you with an email address where you could email those questions, and we will get in touch with Dr. Ybarra, and we will most definitely answer your question, and we will most definitely respond. So if you will send an email to office@worldpatientsalliance.org, office@worldpatientsalliance.org, or you could just simply type your question in the chat. And Tessa, who's with us, and I failed to introduce, I'm sorry about that. Tessa Glenn is our Senior Policy Director, and she's running this presentation today and is behind the scenes putting all of this together. So we certainly thank Tessa for all of her hard work. And if you email us at office@worldpatientsalliance.org, or if you put in the chat box, Tessa will pick that up and she will email Dr. Ybarra and then email you back with his answer. The other thing is that we have another person to call named Harris. Harris is our office manager working out in Pakistan. He's the one that will receive that email, forward it on to Tessa and Dr. Ybarra, and we will get back to you. So without further ado, we have some really good information about where we are in terms of the vaccine development, vaccine distribution, and where we are in terms of the future of the vaccines and the future of fighting COVID. Here today is an expert in vaccines and vaccine approvals and medicine in general. It's Dr. Mike Ybarra. And Mike will tell you a little bit about himself and the work that he's been doing and actually seeing COVID patients. And he's got great firsthand knowledge of what's in development to help patients both avoid COVID through vaccines as well as treat COVID through other types of treatments. So Dr. Ybarra, why don't you tell us a little bit about you and your background and what you do day in and day out?
Yeah, certainly. Thanks, Andy, for inviting me to speak. My name is Mike Ybarra. I'm an emergency physician by training, and I'm a vice president at PhRMA. PhRMA is the trade association representing innovative biopharmaceutical manufacturers, and we're really, we're really proud and lucky to work in an industry that's leading the way in terms of COVID-19 diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines. As you mentioned, I'm and I mentioned as well when I started, I'm an emergency physician. So this year has really the last year has really been all about COVID-19. We've had to learn how to diagnose and treat patients with this, what initially was a very mysterious illness. We know a lot more about it today, and thankfully, because of the work that industry is doing, in the clinical setting, we have a lot more tools in our toolbox to diagnose and treat COVID-19. And certainly we hope that 2021 is going to look a lot different with the rollout of a vaccine that has the ability to really suppress this pandemic. So thanks for inviting me, and I look forward to the discussion today.
Great. Well, thanks for joining us. We appreciate your time. So you're actually seeing COVID patients at the emergency room.
Yeah, absolutely. We're
Yes.
really, I work in DC, Washington, DC. I live in Maryland, which is just right outside of the city, but I've been working in DC clinically for the last 10 years as an attending physician at one of the academic hospitals here. But I did my residency training in medical school in DC as well. DC is a really interesting city. There are a handful of hospitals, and the one that I work at is an academic center, so we take care of really complicated patients with cancer, transplants, a number of serious illnesses. And like every hospital in the US and around the world, we haven't been spared of COVID-19 patients. Early in the pandemic, it really felt like that was all we were seeing. For the first few months, when a lot of the country had kind of closed down, volumes really dropped, but then really all we were seeing were patients that had COVID-19. As the summer came and then the fall came, volumes picked back up. So patients that kind of had typical emergency department complaints or symptoms like chest pain, strokes, we started seeing those as well. And now we're still seeing high volumes of those kind of typical emergency department patients, but with a new surge of COVID-19 patients. So it's really been a tremendous year. And then, with the increased surge that we're seeing in COVID-19 patients, volumes have definitely picked up.
All right. So you really are on the forefront, both of seeing patients, but also with your role at PhRMA, you're very much involved with the development of vaccines and potential treatments to help people fight this disease. One of the things that we know is that there's a lot of chatter around the world today about these vaccines because they were so rapidly developed. And even though the technology for making these vaccines is not new, it's really the first time that technology, I think, has been put in place in a mass population. And so there's understandably some trepidation about taking these viruses that were developed, these vaccines that were developed in less than a year. What message would you have, knowing the insides and outs of COVID vaccine and the vaccines? What message would you have for the hundreds of millions of patients that our members represent about the safety of these vaccines that have been produced to date?
Certainly, that's a great question, and it's one that we're getting a lot. It's an understandable question because to most people that are kind of looking in on the vaccine development process, it feels like it's happened really, really quickly. And it has, because it needed to happen really quickly. Vaccine is a tool that we absolutely need to suppress the pandemic. But it's important to note that no steps were skipped. And when we found efficiencies, it was kind of for a couple of reasons. Number one, we built on a tremendous knowledge about the development of these new mRNA vaccines that are kind of at the forefront. And in addition to that, we just have decades of knowledge about viruses and about vaccines, so we could really kind of harness that expertise very, very quickly. So that's number one. And then number two, whereas traditionally drug development and vaccine development happens, over the course of years and things happen in series, companies, manufacturers were able to do things in parallel. So for example, start manufacturing vaccine before they even knew if their product would be approved or authorized or even effective. Doing things like adaptive clinical trials or digital clinical trials, do things with much more efficiency because the urgency was so clearly there. So these vaccines are have been gone through kind of all the appropriate steps, all the phases of the clinical trial. So I would just implore everyone to obviously not just take my word for it, but kind of look at all the background that's been submitted to the various regulatory agencies, the data transparency, the data that's been submitted to world-renowned medical journals like the New England Journal of Medicine, and just feel comfortable that it's safe, and more importantly, or as importantly, it's highly effective. These vaccines that have been authorized to date are really, really effective, really gold standard level effective. When you think about the most effective vaccines in the world, you think about measles, which is 98% effective. And so then these COVID vaccines that have been authorized to date are upwards of 95% effective. And you compare that to a flu shot, which is anywhere from 40 to 60% effective at preventing flu, that's really, really amazing science. So no steps have been skipped. These are safe vaccines that have been looked at by the regulatory agencies, and they're also highly effective.
Right, so safety is important, efficacy is important, but it could be both a safe vaccine and a very effective vaccine, but it doesn't work if you can't get it.
Yeah.
So we know that the two vaccines that have been approved here in the United States and by regulators really around the world now, we see every week another regulators approving these two vaccines that have already been approved and shipped. The question that I have is that those two vaccines that have been approved require pretty extreme cold storage. And we know that the manufacturers have known that and that they've been preparing for that. And maybe in the US, distribution won't be as much of a challenge as it might be in other developing nations. So what could you tell us about how this vaccine will be distributed worldwide, not just in the US, but around the world? They don't have these kind of cold storage facilities that could store a vaccine that requires this kind of temperature storage.
Yeah, certainly. Well, I think just stepping back for a half second, each vaccine, no matter what, regardless of pandemic, every vaccine has slightly different storage and handling requirements. Some vaccines require to be refrigerated, others require to be frozen. Some are given by shots, some are given orally. So every vaccine is a little bit different. And so then, because of that, as an industry trade association, what we talk about is needing to have multiple shots on goal. And what we mean by that is multiple companies looking at multiple modalities, multiple approaches, so that you can really, have multiple chances of success, because not every vaccine candidate is going to kind of meet the target, the endpoint that it needs of highly safe and efficacious. As I think many folks on this line recognize, drug development is a very risky process, and not every product that is studied is ultimately approved. So we need multiple shots on goal for that reason, but we also need multiple shots on goal because different vaccines are going to be better suited for different environments. And companies have done a tremendous amount to invest in cold storage and distribution to meet the challenges that some of these vaccines might have. But there are other vaccines that are being studied that are, perhaps, single dose, for example, that might be better in different situations, or ones that can be refrigerated that might be more appropriate for different settings, like outpatient settings. And so there are a variety of approaches being looked at. Companies are invest heavily to make sure that their vaccine can be accessible to as broad a population as possible. And then we have multiple companies looking at multiple modalities for the reasons that I mentioned, so that we can address the needs of very diverse patient populations around the world.
Great. Well, thank you for that. We see now that, again, COVID cases have been rising around the world. Really to unprecedented levels. It's a really scary time for people all around the world. Yep. And really, what message do you think you'd be able to send to the leaders of these nonprofit organizations, these NGOs that represent these hundreds of millions of patients? So what kind of messaging would you like to send them that they can send along to their constituents so that they have hope?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think we have to keep doing the things that we know that work, while we're waiting for the vaccine to fully roll out. Things like masks, social distancing, and hand washing are really the basic public health measures that work really well to suppress the spread of the virus. So keep doing those things in the meantime. And the vaccine is really worth waiting for because it is so highly effective. The 95% effectiveness rate means that if it's broadly distributed, we can reach high levels of a vaccinated population, then we'll be able to suppress the pandemic. I think these questions, though, that are being asked are totally, these are very appropriate questions. As I mentioned at the beginning, I work in emergency department. I went through a very similar set of questions with my emergency department colleagues when the vaccine was being rolled out to them. We get the same questions kind of regardless of where you're at in the medical spectrum. Everybody wants to know that it's safe, that it's effective, the types of questions that we're getting, regardless of setting, are very, very similar. So I think it's fair to ask the questions. And we're here to be a resource. We want to be a resource, and we want to make sure that folks feel comfortable and that their questions are addressed. But while we're waiting, in the meantime, keep up the things that we know that work: the masks, the hand washing, the social distancing, because the highly effective vaccine is worth waiting for. We want to make sure that we keep people safe while we're waiting to get the vaccine distributed.
So speaking of distribution, I had heard that there are companies that are developing other forms of vaccine that first won't require that cold storage you talked about a few seconds ago, but also that would be much easier to distribute in countries around the world, such as a vaccine maybe in pill form or a nasal spray or things like that. Have you heard any companies that are in development of that? And if so, how far along are they?
Sure. So the leading the leading vaccine candidates right now that have been authorized are what we call mRNA vaccines. mRNA uses a technology that has really been in development for over a decade, but it came of age during this COVID time, and the two authorized vaccines in the US are both using mRNA technology, which is really, really exciting. And I didn't mention earlier, but I'll mention it now. I actually participated in one of the clinical trials for the mRNA vaccine. I was really, really cool to be a part of that process, and also to kind of, again, share with my colleagues, like I trust the process and I want to be a part of it and be able to tell folks that this process was done appropriately. I can say it was done appropriately because I participated in a trial. I got 2 doses of what ended up being placebo. I found out that the 2 doses I got were placebo. But I had to do daily logs. I had to contact and be interviewed by a nurse, almost every week after receiving the shots. So, I went through the process, and I feel very comfortable that all the steps were taken because I actually saw it in one of the clinical trials. But then shortly after finding out I got placebo, I was able to get the vaccine as well. So I've received 1 dose of vaccine, and I'm waiting to get my second in about 2 weeks from now. So, again, these mRNA vaccines are really, really exciting. They're really effective. And they got a lot of attention because they're the first that have been authorized, but there are others that are being looked at. You probably heard of AstraZeneca partnered with Oxford, Johnson & Johnson. They're both looking at adenovirus vector vaccines. And then there are others that are looking at other approaches like what we call protein subunit vaccines that are being looked at. All of these approaches are being studied. They're just at various phases of development. And the ones that you mentioned, the kind of oral and pill form, are being studied. They're just earlier in the process, like maybe phase 1 or phase 2. We do have other vaccines that are given orally and that are given intranasally. So there are examples like cholera, for example, is an oral vaccine. The flu vaccine is sometimes given as a nasal vaccine. So there is precedent for these things, and they are being looked at in the COVID setting as well. They're just earlier in the phases of clinical trial. And when most of us talk about COVID-19 vaccines, we focus on the mRNA vaccines because those are the ones that have currently been authorized and that are furthest along in the process. But there are others, certainly.
Well, we're glad to see that you haven't turned into some form of a gorilla after getting your first dose of the vaccine. You feel good? No side effects to speak of?
Yeah, no, I got the vaccine a week and a day ago. I guess when this is played, it'll be 2 days, 1 week and 2 days. And I was actually very anxious to feel something because when I got the placebo as part of the clinical trial, I really didn't feel anything. And so when I found out I got placebo and then was able to get vaccine, I was just kind of, very anxious to know if it was different. I did feel a little bit of arm soreness, but that was pretty much it. Just a little bit of arm soreness, which is a really common side effect. There are side effects with the vaccines, so it's good to talk about that. Arm soreness is probably the most common one because you got a shot and there's a little bit of that's your immune system working. That's a good thing.
Yeah. So you mentioned the flu shot, and the thing that comes to mind about the flu shot for me is that I've always heard that if you get the flu shot and you still get the flu, because we know it's not 100% effective, that the symptoms aren't as bad, that it's not as severe. Have they seen that with COVID, that the people that got the vaccine but still went on and got COVID, did they get less severe version of COVID, or is it too soon to have that type of data?
No, that actually was looked at in the clinical trial, and both of the mRNA vaccines that filed for authorization in the US and that did receive authorization really looked at that question, and it's important. It's an important one to answer because some patients, a small number of people that got vaccine did also get COVID-19, much smaller than the people that got placebo. But the vaccines were very effective at preventing that small number of people from getting severe COVID-19. So that's an important benefit of the vaccine as well, that in the small number of people, there was a huge difference in those that received, the vaccine versus placebo. Much higher number of folks that got placebo got COVID. And then of those, almost all of them, all of the severe cases were in the placebo group. So really effective at preventing severe COVID-19 as well.
So it's effective in preventing COVID, but if you still get COVID, it's effective in preventing bad COVID. Is that fair to say?
Right. Yeah, that's right. And COVID's a really odd disease because you have a huge spectrum of illness. I am not aware of any other disease that causes some people to feel almost nothing or have these asymptomatic cases, all the way to having people die. That is such a huge spectrum of illness that's really unparalleled or unprecedented. And again, not something that I'm aware of happening really in many other diseases, that you have such a wide spectrum. So being able to prevent severe disease is really equally important. We want to prevent and crush the pandemic, but we also really want to prevent severe disease, because that severe disease is what's obviously causing serious loss of life, and also hurting the healthcare system and the infrastructure and the ability to care for patients when we have so many people that are hospitalized.
Yeah. One of the questions that come from our members a lot, especially recently, is for people that get vaccinated. Mm-hmm. Are they still able to spread the virus? So people that get vaccinated may feel, hey, I don't need to wear a mask anymore. I don't need to socially distance anymore. I'm immune to this disease. Can they still spread it to their family members and other people, even if they're immune to it?
Yeah, that's a great question. Really encourage folks to still wear the mask even after you've gotten vaccinated. Again, I've received one dose of vaccine, so I'm not fully protected. But my plan is to continue wearing a mask for the foreseeable future, because we just don't really know yet. There's some indication in one of the clinical trials of an authorized mRNA vaccine that there might be a decreased transmission risk. But we need to further study it to really have a good answer to that. I think that the question that you're asking is, could you be an asymptomatic carrier? Like, could you be an asymptomatic carrier of COVID if you got the vaccine and then share it with your family members? And it is possible. And so we need to be very careful about that. And that's something that a lot of healthcare practitioners are thinking about, because healthcare workers are kind of early on for getting the vaccine. So how do you need to behave around your family members, for example, if you've gotten the vaccine? And I think a lot of us are really taking the tact and the precaution to just assume that you still can transmit it. So continue to wear the mask, do everything that we know that works, so that we're contributing both from a vaccine standpoint and then also from the public health measure standpoint, the mask, the social distancing, and the hand washing.
Great. So being told we only have time for one more question. So is there a lot in development, or are you able to touch on that?
Absolutely.
We talk about the things that are out there now that are in development, and what about in development?
Totally. Yeah. No, just like vaccines, we focus on the things that are already authorized or that are kind of, furthest along in the development, but there's a lot in the pipeline. And in those 5 areas, there are a number of medicines being looked at, new antivirals, for example, new approaches to addressing the overactive immune system. So the pipeline is really robust for both vaccines and then also for these therapeutics. So there's a lot going on for earlier stage clinical trials so that we have effective therapies, kind of knowing that this virus is with us. So we need to have good treatments to be able to help people that get COVID-19.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dr. Ybarra, very helpful information. You've given me hope. You hopefully have given hope to all of our nonprofit leaders out there who can then transfer that hope. Am I wrong that it sounds like you sound hopeful? You feel hopeful about the future?
Well, it's 2021 now, and I think we all hope that this is the year that we'll be able to turn the page on the pandemic, and we have the tool that we need to be able to do that with a highly effective vaccine. So I'm hopeful, and I think the focus now for us is to make sure that people are taking advantage of the therapeutic options that are out there, and then also that we're addressing any vaccine confidence issues so that folks feel confident in taking a vaccine when it's offered to them.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it. I'm already over, so I have to go. But thank you so much for your time. We really, really, really appreciate both your expertise on the R&D side, but also the clinical side. You see patients day in and day out, so that helps your knowledge, of course, and how best to treat those patients. So Dr. Ybarra, thank you so much for your time, and have a great day.
Yeah. Thanks, Andy. Appreciate it.
I'm extremely pleased to introduce Yamin Rashid, who is a leading activist, patient advocate, and a politician. She is currently the Minister of Health of Punjab province, which is the largest province of Pakistan with a population of over 120 million people. So Yamin is amongst the founders of the patient movement in Pakistan. She has established a number of patients organizations, that includes Alzheimer's Pakistan, Thalassemia Federation, Thalassemia Society, Janda Society. And so these are the leading organizations, and I'm very pleased and the pleasure of being working with her for the last 26 years. And we are extremely grateful to her for participating in today's workshop, and not only recorded, but to be there in person and giving a live presentation. I know how busy she is. Pakistan, as some of you may know, that Pakistan has been very successful in combating COVID-19. So we would like to hear from Yamin about her experience of dealing with this pandemic. And we would also like to hear a bit about her experience as patient advocate and how she shifted from being a patient advocate to being the Minister of Health. Over to Yamin.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful to the World Patients Alliance for giving me an opportunity to share my experience in Pakistan. So initially, I'd like to start off with a little bit of an introduction. It's a long story. I'm a 70-year-old woman with a long history of activism. And I'd like to first introduce you to Pakistan. We are actually the 5th most populated country in the world. And Punjab, which I am leading in the health department as the minister, is the largest province. And as Hussein has already told you, we have 110 million people who are living in Punjab. I believe health is a political choice. And when you talk about politics, there's a constant or a continuous struggle for power among competing interests. And that's how I believe in it, because that's what WHO also says about it. Long time ago, I'm talking now about 44 years ago, when I was a medical student, I realized that health was not really the focus of the government. And I became a member of the Students' Union, first as a general secretary, and then the president of Fatma Jinnah Medical College Union, so that I could raise a voice for the patients. So I established various societies there which could look after the patient's interest. And that was my initial beginning of supporting patients who were there in the hospitals and needed our attention. I continued once I became a doctor. The Pakistan Medical Association was an active association whose motto was not only to look after the rights of the doctors, but also to look after the rights of the patients. That was the leading motto. So I joined Pakistan Medical Association in 1988, and I was very lucky to be elected as the first woman president of Pakistan Medical Association in the year 2000. And that particular moment in time, I had an ample opportunity to work from this platform to advocate the cause of patients, because it was extremely important. I always felt that we were always focused on what was happening to the medical profession, never focused what was happening to the patients. And that is why what I continued was that it became a natural part of me that as president of Pakistan Medical Association, I started advocating for the patient's rights. And based on that, the first time a healthcare commission, I was the one who initiated that we must have a body an absolutely autonomous body which should actually regulate health, particularly focusing and ensuring patients' rights and ensuring the provision of safe healthcare. And we managed to get that established in 2007-8. And I'm very lucky today that as a minister, it's actually one of my biggest supports because it is constantly monitoring patients' rights. They are ensuring that every patient is getting their proper right in the medical services. Along with that, they are also trying to ensure that the healthcare which is being given is up to the mark and up to the standard. It's always my interest, we established the first Pakistan Patient Safety Initiative in the year 2000. And it was not only, I was always interested that the community has to actually participate. Then only can we make it a viable organization. And I got a lot of support from the community. And that is one of the reasons that I think we have been quite successful in Pakistan advocating patients' rights. My story with thalassemia actually started off when I started working in prenatal diagnosis. I realized that the patients were being not given the due treatment, and I established Thalassemia Society of Pakistan, in which I worked with the help of my other friends and doctors to ensure that patients were getting proper treatment. And we kept on advocating the cause of how important it was that patients should be looked after properly by the state. We established the Pakistan Thalassemia Federation, where I'm working as a general secretary even now, to ensure that there should be a standard protocol for treatment of patients. The patients' rights, particularly about thalassemics, should be looked after, and we were trying to establish laws to support these patients. And of course, you know the story about Alzheimer's. I'm working as a patron for Alzheimer's Pakistan. Hussein and I have been working together in all these endeavors. And it's always been a very satisfying feeling that you are helping in contributing something toward the patient's needs. But however, you know, when you become an activist, then you do get a lot of bashing also. And particularly since I was a professor teaching in a medical school, I was always censored for speaking up too much. And then, of course, you can see how the state reacts at times, and inquiries were heard, conducted against me that I wasn't actually doing my work, which I should be doing, and I had to convince them that my work is to look after the rights of the patients also. And at one particular moment in time, I also got fired for it. But then, naturally, when I went to the court, they reinstated me on this, on my plea, that what she speaks is actually not only, she's speaking up for the patients. There should be somebody speaking up for the patients, so I've been lucky in that way. When they terminated me from my services, the most heartening thing was my patients sitting outside the hospital protesting for me. So I think that was one of my most satisfying feeling, that I thought I had contributed something towards the patients. If they reacted in such a way, they felt that I was contributing something towards their welfare. And I was lucky. I realized that as long as I remain and I keep on advocating, I would not be able to improve the situation for patients. I need to be in the government or become a voice. And so I joined Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf in 2010. And at that particular moment in time, I became an opposition voice in healthcare. I was constantly raising a voice for the patients, saying how important it is. The state has to use its resources and it has to improve the services for patients. And because of that particular thing, I was chosen by Mr. Imran Khan and I contested elections. I thought it's just to lighten up the note, that was, our election hustings in 2018, and Tehreek-e-Insaf won the elections, and we were very lucky that we had the majority in Punjab government, and I was then, for me, I think one of the most important thing was this long relationship that we've had with patients, advocates, that gave me this, I think, an impetus to join politics and look after the patients' right. So I think it was one of the most rewarding and lasting partnerships that I have. And one of the person who has always been there, always in the background, but always being there, pushing me to continue working hard was Hussein. And I think today is a good day to acknowledge all the effort that he's really done for patients. It has been really a tremendous and a very rewarding journey that we have had together in trying to improve the situation for patients in Pakistan. I got, after PTI won the elections, I was made the Health Minister of Punjab and was given the responsibility of looking after the health services in Punjab. 2018 and 2019, we were trying to improve the services. And 2019 January, we were hit by COVID, as the whole world was hit by this pandemic. However, the COVID response has been acknowledged internationally. They have acknowledged that Pakistan has done a good job in trying to control the number of patients who got infected. And I've already published a couple of articles on it, which have been in the international publications, in which we have mentioned the steps that we had taken to ensure that things should improve. And if you look at the figures, although Punjab is nearly half of Pakistan, we still did much better than the other provinces for a simple reason that there was an extremely concerted effort between the government and organizations who work in the community with patients to ensure that patients got the best possible treatment, and our prevention work had to be enhanced also with the support of these organizations. If I compare the situation with the neighboring countries, you could actually see exactly how many cases per million population there were. Pakistan definitely did much better than its neighbors, and Punjab definitely did better than its other neighboring provinces. It's not that there was anything extraordinary, but I think it was an organized effort which made all the difference in the world. If I compare the deaths, you can easily see that deaths per million population were also the least in Punjab. What were the key factors? I mean, that's something I'd really like to share with all of you. I'm sure everybody sitting here is concerned about COVID in the world. Until and unless we have mass immunization, we're going to live with this for quite, I think, another year and a half, till countries like ours, like Pakistan, also manage to get adequate amount of vaccines to be given to their population, particularly when it's such a large population. And it has been decided that 20% of it would be, people would be getting it. So what we did was, we ensured that there was a top-down ownership. The Prime Minister, the Chief Minister led from the front, a national command and a control center was established between all the provinces. The Chief Ministers led the efforts through cabinet committee meetings, and I personally looked after the COVID response. Timeliness of the response was extremely important. We had heard about COVID, we started working from January onwards. Although the first case which came into Pakistan was on 26th of February, we tried to prepare ourselves for it. So timeliness of the response was important. Developing field hospitals, quarantine facilities, labs, and then of course quarantine facilities for patients with no symptoms, mild symptoms, or moderate to severe symptoms, and so as to prevent community spread. The initial response was to ensure that we isolate people to prevent the spread. So what we did was, we set up a corona monitoring cell in the primary secondary healthcare department, which did all the data management and all the districts and reported cases follow-up, contact tracing, and the resource distribution, including HR. The human resource Corona cell was also established at the specialized healthcare department, because they were looking after the very serious patients, the ones who required ventilators, oxygen supply. So they are the ones who also set up a cell, and they were all doing a coordinated effort, including the Corona unit at Mayo, which is one of the largest hospitals in Lahore. There is 2,700 bedded hospital, out of which 600 beds had been just given for Corona patients. The most important part was developing a mass isolation and a quarantine facility, because we realized that if we do not quarantine people, a lot of our people cannot really isolate themselves at home for a simple reason that there is not enough space at home for them to. So what we did initially, when the first lockdown came in the month of March, we ensured that any patient, any person who was diagnosed with Corona was then isolated at centers, either centers which they wanted to go themselves, which we had converted some hotels into centers where they wanted to pay. Otherwise, we established huge field quarantine centers and field hospitals for patients to be isolated there, or people with Corona to be isolated, even if they were asymptomatic. And I think that is one of the major reasons that the sort of mass spread which was witnessed in other provinces which were permitting home isolation did not occur in Punjab till the month of May, when we saw that we had organized enough resources that we permitted them home isolation. And that's the time when we had our major, and lockdown was finished off, and we had our major spike. And we had large number of patients. Of course, we had our first surge in the month of June. But by then we had increased the capacity of our hospitals. When the pandemic started, we could only look after we could test about 400 tests a day. And today, I think when we look at it, we have now established 18 BSL-3 labs, and we are now capable, and we established another couple of labs, and we are now established, particularly when we do pool testing, that we can now look after more than 22,000 tests a day. The important part was forming an experts group which would constantly work and would do data crunching. Information was continuously analyzed, strategies were devised, and it was extremely important that all the patients got a uniform protocol treatment, because initially, with very little knowledge, things were coming up. Should we use chloroquine? Should we use remdesivir? Should we use Actemra? Are we going to use steroids? Do we use antibiotics? Are we going to use antivirals? So we had an expert group which worked day in, day out to ensure that we give the best possible treatment to patients, so as to help them out when they go serious or they require to. And we learned then that positive pressure oxygen was far more beneficial as compared to ventilators. And vent was actually the last resort when we thought everything else had failed, and we started producing vent results. So initially in the first phase, we had more fatalities as compared to when you look at the second wave that we are going through at the moment. We ensured a huge amount of money was sanctioned. 14 billion rupees were given to Punjab Health Department to ensure that we had an uninterrupted supply of required resources, necessary equipment, PPE. Now we are in a position, we are making our own protective equipment in Pakistan. We have started producing ventilators also in Pakistan, and we have started exporting all these things. And budgets were provided on a timely basis to all the hospitals to ensure that the supplies were adequate to look after the patients. Trainings and capacity building, I think it was a tremendous effort by the health department, particularly my team. A huge number of doctors. They are roughly nearly 10,000 doctors and nurses were trained, particularly to look after this huge inflow of patients. And I think this was one of the good parts of our training, that now people have become more confident to look after patients. But the important thing is, with the lockdown there, you do understand, in a country like Pakistan, where they're daily wage earners and where people have to are dependent on earning every day, the social safety nets were not there. And the Prime Minister, I think, did an excellent service by ensuring the SARS program. It was launched to ensure that people, the poorest of poor, which was nearly about 29 to 30% of the population, managed to get enough money from the government so that they could buy their rations, And of course, we had a huge contribution from non-governmental organizations, philanthropists, particularly patients' organizations, who stepped forward and contributed to ensure that adequate supply, not only of food, but of medicines, of sanitizers, of gloves, of masks, were there for everybody. Of course, we had virtual models that we looked into, but what good part was that we managed to establish telemedicine units to provide online OPD services. A psychological helpline was also established that provided expert counseling from expert psychologists to patients. You do realize, of course, when patients are isolated or their families are isolated, and when you are so, you have hardly any knowledge about the pandemic, the sort of depression which occurs. So I think having this sort of a psychological helpline was one of the very important steps that was taken. But then we also had to bring in a law, because there were a lot of things that we had to do. Like, for example, when we did smart lockdowns, which meant that you close down a street or you close down a road, where the number of patients were increased, you needed administrative powers, and you had to confine people to their home, required administrative powers for that. And so an ordinance was also brought in to ensure that no law should be broken and people should work under the law. Community and patients organization, as I said, right from the beginning, was a huge help for us. Telephone helplines, social media campaign, support for non-COVID patients, particularly you do realize thalassemia patients would have suffered the most. For a simple reason, when people in COVID were scared of coming and giving blood donations, and those children were dependent on blood transfusions. But I'm very grateful to all our organizations, particularly working with the Federation, that they ensured that blood was there for the patients and they were all being looked after. One of the highlights of our management was that we also ensured that there were adequate hospital facilities for women who had to deliver. There were COVID hospitals assigned so that women who were pregnant and had COVID could go to those hospitals and get safe deliveries. We have run trials. We have working with the Chinese on a vaccine, and we've gone through our third phase. And now, of course, we have to ensure access to vaccine. We are hoping that the first number of vaccines which are expected to come would be coming by end of January. So hopefully, people would learn by our response. Any questions which need to be asked, you're most welcome to send them to me. I would be ensuring that we give you a detailed reply to those questions so that we could help our COVID fellows all over the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Rashid, for an excellent presentation. My first question is about vaccine. What are your plans to ensure that the vaccine reaches everybody? Pakistan is a huge country, fifth last most populated country in the world. How would you ensure, and what is the sort of timeline that you have in mind?
Basically, the federal government is working on it. $250 million, which of course is not going to seem a lot to people outside, but it's a lot to us, have been kept separately for vaccine purchase. And we are already at the moment negotiating with the major companies which have produced, like Pfizer. We are working with the Chinese. We will try our level best to ensure that by the end of the year, a majority of the people should be able to get the vaccine, because of course that would be the only way to get it. But the initial first response that we are going to get is we will be supported by COVAX, which is of course WHO going to support to ensure that developing countries like ours get enough vaccine to first vaccinate the most vulnerable group, the healthcare workers, by ensuring that 20% of the population gets the required amount of vaccine, and they're helping us.
One last question is that how do you, what message would you give to other ministers around the world, of your experience of working with the patients in the community? How important is to work with them?
I think what's extremely important, because you must understand, patients are the most important people in any sort of the treatment, any sort of treatment that you give. Until and unless you listen to the problems of the patients and listen to what they're saying, it might be very difficult. One of the biggest problems that we faced was that people would go into a depression because they had to be kept isolated in the hospital from their families. And therefore, we started ensuring that helplines were made so they could talk to their telephone should be available, mobile telephone, so that you actually see their near and dear ones being looked after. So that was one of the things which came forward when we started talking to patients' organizations. So I think it's important to involve patients' organizations, particularly in such a huge pandemic. They would be, because they would be involved, like patients who had thalassemia, their families were worried about their blood, and if they had not communicated with us, we might not have highlighted and ensured the supply of blood. So all these things, I think, is extremely important to take patients' organization into confidence and hear what they have got to say so that you could give better services to patients.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rashid, for an excellent presentation. If we get more questions, we'll definitely get back to you.
We'll take any questions that people have now for Dr. Rashid, or if people have any questions for Dr. Ybarra, I could tell you that he is the Chief Medical Officer at the, as I said, PhRMA, and also a clinician who sees patients in the emergency room. And if you have any questions for him, such as, you know, how far are we along in vaccine development and what vaccines are on the horizon? One of the things that I talked about with him on that video is the fact that they are developing the COVID vaccine in pill form and in nasal spray form so that they won't have the distribution problems that they may have with these cold storage vaccines that have to be stored at incredibly cold temperatures. So he talks a little bit about what's happening in the horizon in terms of innovative vaccines that are coming. And he also talks a lot about the best ways to beat COVID. A lot of what Dr. Rashid already said with the mask wearing, the social distancing, and of course, with everybody getting vaccines, the world should look like a completely different place in a few more months, or at least a year. When 2020 comes to an end, we really think that this pandemic will also come to an end. But I would want to remind everybody to follow us on social media. Up on the screen, you saw there's a link that keeps going up to our Facebook, our Twitter, our LinkedIn pages. And so we are building our social media platforms, and we'll be communicating with both our patient organizations as well as patients directly in the on social media. I want to remind everybody to fill out the member survey. It's been emailed a couple of times. We may email it one more time just to give everybody a last chance. We've had really good response, by the way, but we would like to hear from all of our members as to how we can best serve you and what are the issues that are important to your organization, and how can your organization access our international platform to help your voice and your disease's voice be heard and your country's voice be heard. So all different ways of how we're going to be interacting with our patient organization members, and you'll be receiving an email next week that will give you all of this information on how to get involved, some of the work that we have done in 2020, such as getting involved with Patient Safety Day and things of that nature. And then how can we best serve you moving forward? You'll see our plans for 2021. How can we involve you on the international advocacy arena? And how can you involve us? If you have a local issue that's happening in your country and you need a stronger patient voice, how can we work together to ensure that the patient voice is at the center of policies that are being developed in your country? Or if we learn of a problem in the government at your country where maybe they're denying access to certain important medicines or things of that nature, we want to help you by giving you the tools that you may need to be the best advocate. So lots of stuff that will be happening in 2021, lots of ways that you'll be able to get involved. We're continuing to grow as an organization. As Penny said, we're at almost 200 organizations already, and really good, top quality organizations. We don't accept everybody that applies, and we don't seek to just get big numbers. We want good quality organizations who will really do a good job in representing the patient voice. And so it really is a good opportunity for everybody to get involved with the organization over the next year. And you can also email any questions that you have to office@worldpatientsalliance.org. You see the number there on the screen, office@worldpatientsalliance.org. Thank you, everybody. You can see thank yous in all the languages that we could find up on the screen. And so with that, I'll close this out and thank everybody for attending. And thank you, board members, for attending. And everybody have a great day and a great night.